Welcome to Chess Dog. Today's game is hot off the presses. This is Magnus Carlsen versus Wesley So at the Super United Rapid and Blitz in Zagreb, Croatia. This game is a blitz game, 5 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. And one thing about Magnus Carlsen, we know he's the best player in the world at classical time controls, but he's just as good really at fast time controls, which is what makes this game a bit of a shock. But Wesley So is no slouch, and he really knows how to play chess, and if you give him a little room, he'll shock you. So again, Carlsen has white, Wesley So has black. Let's jump right in. E4, E5, knight F3, and we get a basic Italian game on the board very quickly. Knight B to D2, the idea, obviously, the knight F1, knight G3 maneuver, which is very familiar to us in this structure. And A5. A6 is also a possibility, basically to allow this bishop to tuck away at A7. With A5, as Wesley So plays, black gains more space, but also the B5 square becomes a little sensitive too. So, they're both good. Knight to F1, and notice Carlsen does this before castling. He wants to gain a tempo or save a tempo by playing this knight F1, knight G3 maneuver before castling. Castles, knight G3, bishop E6, immediately challenging Carlsen's bishop on C4. And Carlsen could take, but after pawn takes, black has very easy play. The pawn at E6 plugs up the D5 and F5 holes. The rook at F8 has a half-open file. The queen can go to E8, G6. Easy play for black. So Carlsen doesn't want to do that. So he takes advantage of this sensitive B5 square because Wesley So decided to play A5. He can play bishop B5 now. Knight to E7, basically playing the same maneuver white just played. Wants to move that knight to G6. Castle, C6 hits the bishop. Bishop to A4, knight to G6, and D4. Magnus expands in the center, playing a normal pawn break for this position and hitting the bishop at C5. The bishop goes to A7. Now H3, keeping a piece, either the knight at F6 or bishop at E6, out of the G4 square. Pawn takes, and he decides to take with the knight instead of with the pawn, and that does hit this bishop, but it turns out Wesley So doesn't mind that, and he plays D5, and here Magnus takes the bishop at E6, and it turns out this might have been a questionable decision. He is grabbing the two bishops, it's true, but black now has a really strong pawn center and control of all of these light squares, and the one bishop he has on the board on A7 is really powerful. It's a beastly bishop, and it's going to be a problem from Carlsen for the rest of the game. Bishop to C2 to defend the E4 pawn, which was attacked by the knight and the pawn on D5. Computers prefer queen to E1, and also creating some pressure. He might be able to check on E6 later, but bishop C2 was Magnus's choice. And now queen to C7. Do you see what this sneaky little move threatens? That's right, he's threatening to just take the knight on G3. And white could not recapture the queen because it is pinned by this very strong bishop at A7, which we've already mentioned. So the threats are already beginning from Wesley So. And in order to get out of that pin, Carlsen plays king to H2, already a sign that his position is not going as well as he had hoped. Wesley So is pressing and is better in this position, and he takes the E4 pawn. So he's won a pawn. The pawn cannot be recaptured because, remember, this knight is pinned and cannot move. Queen to E2 to retake the pawn at E4, but now knight to F4 hits the queen with tempo and puts the knight in a nice attacking square. Carlsen decides to play queen to E1. If he takes the knight, which is probably the best choice, although there are no good choices, queen F4, and after king H1, E3 to undermine the support of the knight on G3, and black has a better position for sure, but it's better for white than what happens in the game after queen to E1. Rook A to D8, grabbing the open file with his rook. Bishop takes E4. Now, notice black has pressure on this bishop and also pressure on this diagonal. So if he can get rid of this knight or make the knight move, then he'll really expand his advantage. So Wesley So plays H5. with the intention of playing h4, kicking that knight at g3 away. Bishop to e3 to challenge that bishop at a7, which has been a real thorn in Carlsen's side. So instead of getting rid of it, Wesley So just shifts it to another diagonal. Now, the queen and bishop battery put immense pressure on Carlsen's castled position. He moves the king to g1 to get out of that pressure, or alleviate the pressure a little bit. Knight takes bishop, bishop takes knight. Now, he can't retake the knight, because if he does, knight to e2 check, gives up the knight, and when the knight is recaptured, queen to h2 mate would be played. So he cannot retake the knight at e4. He has to take the knight at f4, and now rook takes f4, and the pressure on white's castle position just increases. Magnus grabs the pawn at h5, but now rook to f5 is played. Computers give this really great variation, really amazing. Rook to f3, just hanging the rook, but the queen is threatening mate on h2, and if the knight comes back to block that, then rook takes f2, rook f2, queen takes g3, and if the queen grabs the knight, you just check, and then you end up picking up the rook at a1, and black would win. He chooses something a little safer, and also good enough, rook to f5, but this allows Carlsen at the very least to play f4. The idea, of course, is to block the bishop and queen, and now he is threatening to take the knight on e4. So the knight moves to d2, attacking this rook. It's defended by the rook at d8. Queen takes e6 check, so queen to f7, and queen f7, king f7, knight to g3, rook to b5, and Wesley So is up a clear piece. White has 2 pawns as compensation, but it really isn't enough, and Wesley So will soon recoup those pawns. Rook f to e1, rook takes b2, that's the first pawn, knight to f5, with threats of rook to e7, causing some irritation to Wesley So. So he just plays rook to d7 to control that square, rook a to d1, pinning the knight, but now bishop takes pawn. It defends the knight, and now even the pawn advantage is gone. Wesley So is just up a clear piece with no compensation. a4, rook to d5, hitting the knight, knight to d4, and now g5. That locks this bishop on f4 in place. Rook to e2, knight to c4. Defends the rook at b2, rook e to e1, knight to e3, hits the rook at d1 and the pawn at g2. Rook to b1, of course, Wesley's not going to trade off that rook. Rook takes g2 check, king to h1, rook to g3. After rook b7 check, king g6, knight to c6, rook to d2. And there's actually no way to stop mate in this position, and Magnus resigned. So let's look at what would happen if they played on, just to get some clarification. Knight to e7 check, king h5, rook to b2, rook takes h3 check, king to g1, and he could, he just has to sacrifice a couple of pieces to delay the inevitable mating formation. An amazing game by Wesley So against Magnus Carlsen. Very impressive chess. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.